Welcome, and thank you sincerely for joining me on this journey into the extraordinary realm of America's elite. We're about to venture into a peculiar world where the smallest gesture holds tremendous power to destroy your standing, and selecting the wrong utensil could trigger what amounts to an international crisis of social proportions. Think your social anxiety feels significant right now? Imagine existing in a world where a single dining fork, the wrong one, mind you, could get you permanently excluded from morning brunches for literally decades. Before we properly dive into this fascinating material, I'd encourage you to subscribe if you find what we're exploring genuinely interesting and worthwhile. Drop a comment below about where you're listening from, and more importantly, share which particular piece of cutlery you invariably seem to get wrong every single time. That would probably be the fish fork, which seems to confuse almost everyone. Honestly, on a fundamental level, nobody truly grasps what the fish fork is actually supposed to do, or why it matters so much. So settle yourself comfortably with soft lighting, perhaps turn on a fan to create that soothing ambient noise in the background, and burrow under your absolute coziest blanket. Should you actually want the full Gilded Age experience, the authentic version, try sitting perfectly upright in an uncomfortable straight-back chair while someone methodically judges your spinal alignment from across the room. It's quite the sensation, really. Let's pause here and reflect for a genuine moment. Have you ever seriously pondered just how many outfit changes were required before midday in these circles? Could social exile genuinely result from eating soup with slightly audible slurping? Was there truly an appropriate and correct technique for fainting gracefully at a garden party? How would you actually fare through 7 consecutive days of handshake evaluations, oyster fork navigation, and 3-hour conversations exclusively about weather? Why did these people fixate on calling cards with such intensity? What exactly would happen if a butler accidentally handed you the wrong hat? And perhaps most pressing of all, what was the actual protocol you'd follow after sneezing? Consider yourself officially awakened and transported. You've just materialized in 1895 Manhattan. You're recently wealthy. New money, as they'd say with undisguised disdain. Woefully underdressed in the eyes of society, and disturbingly unaware of the proper angle for performing a graceful curtsy. Best of luck navigating what comes next in this bewildering world. Breakfast wasn't meant to be relaxing, a fact you'd discover quickly if you'd grown up in a mansion. What looked like a simple morning meal was actually an elaborate performance, carefully choreographed and relentlessly scrutinized. Picture this. Your dining room is cavernous, resembling a museum wing more than a space for eating. The silverware surrounding your plate has been polished to an almost military shine. You mustn't appear tired, hungry, or even particularly alive, really. Your job is to calmly consume grapefruit juice while ignoring your stomach's desperate pleas for actual pancakes. The grandfather clock chimes 7. Its echo bounces off ceilings so high you'd swear they had their own weather patterns. Your chair, one of 12 arranged to communicate both power and profound discomfort, scrapes backward with the quietest possible sound. Any louder, and you might disturb the ancestral spirits depicted in oil paintings covering every wall. Spirits who seem permanently focused on critiquing your posture and life decisions. The table stretches before you like a continent of starched linens and intimidating geometry. Your place setting is an art installation masquerading as dinnerware, each element positioned to catch you in a social misstep. Forks of varying sizes and mysterious spoons lurk nearby, each ready to expose you as an imposter should you reach for the wrong one. Selecting the fish fork before noon instead of the fruit fork? That's the kind of scandal that haunts family correspondence for generations. When you reach for your napkin, the butler, whose apparent job is materializing precisely when you mess up, observes you with the benevolent concern of someone who's witnessed countless similar errors before breakfast even properly began. You must unfold that napkin with enthusiasm that's neither excessive nor half-hearted, then drape it across your lap at the exact midpoint between your knees and your ego. Coffee arrives in a pot so heavy you genuinely wonder whether it was previously employed as a murder weapon. You're certainly not pouring it yourself. That's the staff's responsibility. If fortune smiles, your coffee will be hot. If not, you'll learn that lukewarm beverages represent a centuries-long tradition designed specifically to build character. You may accept cream and sugar, but with moderation. 1 sugar cube signals discipline. 2 indicates you're silently crying for help. Conversation begins, but only obliquely. The weather, travel arrangements, and courteous inquiries about relatives you barely remember constitute acceptable topics. Anything remotely engaging, emotional, or louder than a whisper gets shut down immediately. Should children be present, they speak exclusively when directly addressed, and always in complete sentences that begin with mother or father. Laughter is tolerated, though only the variety that doesn't expose your teeth. Your food arrives in carefully curated but frustratingly insubstantial portions. Melon slices so thin they're practically transparent. Eggs served in absurdly tiny cups. Toast presented in a silver rack that simultaneously keeps it cold and upright, like some sort of edible monument to restraint. Request jam. And it arrives with all the ceremonial weight of a peace treaty negotiation. The communal jam spoon gets passed with hushed solemnity, as if any breach in protocol could spark an international incident. Throughout this entire ordeal, you're executing a series of micro-gestures. You butter toast using the proper knife, never, under any circumstances, the dinner knife. Break off bite-sized pieces instead of actually biting into anything. Chew in complete silence. Swallow discreetly. Wipe your mouth according to unwritten generational law. When guests arrive, the performance intensifies considerably. Now you must project effortless charm while simultaneously demonstrating complete obliviousness to your own hunger. Ask a polite question about their recent travels. Nod at strategically appropriate moments. Never let your eyes drift toward the clock, no matter how many minutes have elapsed. Eventually, breakfast concludes. You don't simply stand. You wait for the matriarch, or whichever ancestor currently holds power, to gently signal that this ordeal has finally ended. Only then may you fold your napkin precisely, stand with the fluid grace of someone who's never experienced existential dread, and exit the room as though you're not about to sprint to the kitchen for some actual food. You've survived another family breakfast. Breathing may now resume. Perhaps one day soon you'll remember what eating like a human being actually felt like. Enter the bewildering realm of utensil choreography, where a fork becomes a personality test, and every piece of silverware carries a personal vendetta against anyone who grew up eating cereal straight from the box. By the time your plate arrives, you're surrounded by enough knives to make you wonder whether someone's planning subtle surgery between courses. This isn't random arrangement. Every fork, knife, and spoon has been strategically positioned to test your worthiness. Your place setting functions like a mapped-out landscape with more rules governing it than international airspace. Positioned closest to your plate sits the basic fork, though calling it basic feels like a massive understatement. To its left stands the salad fork, recognizable by its slightly smaller stature and the quiet superiority it radiates. Further left, the fish fork waits patiently for its moment, an occasion that may genuinely never arrive, yet for which you must always be completely prepared. Don't mix this up with the dessert fork, which typically hides at the top of your plate like a smug little satellite orbiting your anxiety. Knives operate according to their own completely separate logic. Your dinner knife sits proudly beside the plate, flanked by the butter knife. Small, but potentially dangerous if deployed incorrectly. The fish knife features a blade shaped as though it's perpetually late for a dentist appointment. Even spoons aren't innocent participants. Soup spoons are round and deep, designed for sipping elegantly, while dessert spoons are slightly shallower, meant for coaxing mousse rather than demolishing stew. The teaspoon barely exists, serving primarily as a conversation prop. The real trick? Knowing precisely when to deploy which utensil. Theoretically, the rule is straightforward. Start from the outside and work inward with each successive course. In practice, it's an experiment designed to separate the socially sophisticated from everyone else. Reach for the wrong fork, and you'll catch the eye of some distant relative who hasn't spoken since the Hoover administration, suddenly watching with the predatory intensity of someone who's just found ammunition for years of subtle criticism. That gaze says everything. New money. When soup arrives, you stare down at your options, counting tines and measuring handle lengths while desperately recalling that one etiquette lesson from childhood. Which spoon was it? The round one or the oval? Should you scoop toward yourself or away? The answer, always away, every single time. It's basically a trust fall involving your entire sense of dignity. Bread rolls present another minefield. A tiny bread plate to your left has a butter knife perched delicately on it. But beware, reach too far and you're stealing your neighbor's bread, violating the sacred doctrine of left for bread, right for drinks. Butter gets sliced into minuscule amounts and transferred methodically, never, ever double-dipped. Using the right knife incorrectly somehow registers as worse than using the wrong knife at all. Then dessert approaches. Suddenly you're confronted with spoons and forks that look like they belong in a dollhouse, each designed for a specific confection. It's essentially a secret handshake for people who understand sugar and privilege. That dessert fork, when it appears, often has one wider tine, a subtle hint that you're supposed to cut cake using the fork side like a polite assassin. If dessert happens to be fruit, you'll need the tiny fork that materializes seemingly from nowhere, conjured by a butler with the timing of a stage magician. Meanwhile, you're surrounded by people who appear to select the correct utensil with the nonchalance of Olympic athletes. They chat, they laugh, they barely glance at their forks. Don't be fooled, though. It's all performance, and they've rehearsed extensively. Someone somewhere is keeping score in silence. You'll know you've failed when your family's next reunion mysteriously gets relocated. When the meal finally concludes, there's one last ritual: arranging your utensils on the plate. Don't simply toss them aside. Knives and forks must be positioned at precisely the right angle, signaling to both the staff and to history itself that you've finished and somehow managed to survive. Cross them accidentally, and you're basically declaring culinary war on the entire establishment. You push your chair back, sweating only slightly, and contemplate what you've accomplished. You've navigated a landscape where cutlery functions simultaneously as a tool and a test. Somehow, you made it through. Tomorrow, you'll eat your cereal with a spoon directly from the box, and it will taste like freedom. Old money families treated posture as if it were a moral virtue. Slouch even slightly, and some great aunt draped in pearls would materialize like a Victorian ghost, whispering, "Shoulders back, dear." Proper sitting had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with broadcasting that your bloodstream probably contained inherited wealth. For most people, sitting is a casual affair. You collapse into a chair, let gravity distribute your limbs, and congratulate yourself for remaining upright. Not here. In elite circles, sitting down was a skill, sometimes even an audition. The process began before you even approached the furniture. Walking itself had rules. Glide, don't stomp. Pause, don't rush. If anyone older than you was nearby, you'd wait for them to settle before daring to approach any seating. Sitting too quickly registered as the social equivalent of wearing sweatpants to a wedding. Once seated, the real challenge began. You had to sit all the way back, shoulders aligned perfectly with the chair's frame, knees bent at exactly 90 degrees, ankles gently crossed. Slouching wasn't just lazy, it was considered subversive, an act of subtle rebellion against everything your family stood for. The dreaded mid-meal correction represented the worst possible outcome: a matriarch pausing the conversation to address your posture in front of an entire table of distant relatives, plus at least 2 small dogs wearing neckties. The furniture itself often conspired to enforce propriety. Chairs were typically high-backed, upholstered in fabrics predating electricity, and stiff enough to make your lower back contemplate a life of crime. Armrests were used sparingly, hands positioned gently in your lap or on the table's edge, never dangling like a peasant's. Your elbows represented an eternal battleground. Should they touch the table before dessert, a ripple of horror would pass through the room, followed by a cautionary story about some cousin who went bohemian and now lives in Paris. There existed an entire vocabulary of corrections, each more subtle than the last. A slight cough from the patriarch at the table's far end, a raised eyebrow from an aunt whose spine was straighter than a flagpole. The gentle yet chilling instruction, "Sit up, darling, the photographer is arriving soon." Your spine would snap upright so forcefully you'd hear your ancestors' collective sigh of approval. Children received early training in this crucial skill. Posture was a family value, right up there with fiscal responsibility and pretending to enjoy caviar. Young heirs learned to balance books on their heads, walk the length of the drawing room, then stand for excruciating minutes while someone wearing a brooch explained the difference between poise and looking like you'd lost the will to live. The reward for maintaining perfect posture? The faint hope of inheriting the good silver. To keep you perpetually on your toes, both literally and metaphorically, there were posture drills disguised as family games. After dinner, charades became elaborate exercises in not collapsing. Bridge nights doubled as shoulder checks. Even television watching, if permitted, was a back-straightening experience, often conducted on a sofa so unforgiving it might as well have been constructed from a pure Calvinist guilt. There was always that one cousin who rebelled, sliding down in their seat with arms splayed and knees apart, radiating middle-class energy and impending disgrace. They'd receive a look from the matriarch so powerful it could unpeel wallpaper, and they'd immediately snap back into the approved family silhouette. No one escaped this regime. Not even the family pets eventually learned to sit with dignity bordering on regal after years in this environment. But why all this fuss? Because in elite society, posture wasn't merely about bones and muscles. It represented legacy itself. Uprightness was proof of discipline, refinement, and the ability to endure discomfort for appearance's sake. A straight back meant straight morals, or at least a convincing imitation. You spent every meal as an unwilling participant in the world's quietest Pilates class, enduring tiny corrections and balancing teacups while pretending your spine wasn't aching for a beanbag chair. When the meal finally ended, you stood slowly, exited gracefully, and prepared to repeat this entire performance at luncheon. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, in these circles, your posture will be judged long after your opinions have faded entirely from memory. Sleep easy, shoulders back. Every large estate contained at least one room that nobody used but everyone respected intensely. Perhaps it was the good parlor, a space so pristine it radiated the energy of a hostage situation. Entering without permission meant feeling the weight of generations of ancestors, silently questioning why you couldn't respect basic boundaries. Walking through the mansion's echoing hallways, you'd pass rooms filled with grand pianos, oil portraits, and chairs upholstered in fabric that probably witnessed the Treaty of Versailles being signed. Every space served a specific function. The library for silent, dignified reading. The breakfast room for silent, undignified eating. The drawing room for silent, confusing small talk. But the forbidden room was different. It dominated as the household's apex predator, commanding awe and terror in equal measure. Typically, the forbidden room was the first thing you noticed upon entering the main floor, a shrine to unobtainable elegance, cordoned off from daily life by an unspoken contract. The door stood slightly ajar, teasing you with a sliver of floral carpet and the faint aroma of ancient potpourri. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, illuminating a collection of crystal vases and tea sets so fragile they seemed to shudder if you breathed too forcefully nearby. You learned early on that the forbidden room existed for looking at, not for sitting in, walking through, or even breathing too enthusiastically around. Some families called it the parlor. Others used the term, quote, 3. The rules remained absolutely consistent. Don't touch, don't enter, don't even make direct eye contact with the art. Every piece of furniture was encased in a protective plastic layer, armor specifically designed to withstand either apocalypse or a rogue toddler with sticky hands. The carpet was so plush your feet left no impression, as if it had been manufactured from the collective regrets of anyone who'd ever tracked in dirt. The forbidden room functioned as a monument to family pride, a museum exhibit of good taste, and a constant source of daily anxiety. Why did it exist at all? Nobody genuinely knew. Perhaps it waited in case royalty dropped by unexpectedly. Maybe it served as a living advertisement for the family's taste in uncomfortable seating. One thing was certain. Absolutely nothing should ever be misplaced. A single crooked doily warranted an emergency family meeting. Then there were the objects: fragile porcelain figurines, glass paperweights, and a mysterious clock perpetually set to 3:17. No one remembered why, and changing it was considered genuinely risky behavior. A cabinet displayed commemorative plates from distant relatives' weddings, relatives you'd never actually met. The sofa could double as a medieval torture device. The throw pillows were arranged in formation designed by some distant cousin who'd studied decorative arts in Florence. The true terror was the invisible line at the entrance, that social force field. Cross it without an explicit invitation, and an alarm would sound, not a literal alarm, but something worse. The sharp gasp of a matriarch, or the silent glare of a butler who appeared from absolutely nowhere. Even family pets knew better. The family dog, otherwise a fearless beast, would freeze at the threshold and glance up as if to say, "Quote 4." Special occasions occasionally unlocked the forbidden room's mysteries. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the occasional wake might warrant an audience with the good china. On these hallowed days, everyone tiptoed inside. Voices dropped to reverent whispers, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and palpable tension. Children received briefings beforehand as though they were attending a diplomatic summit. Hands in pockets. Shoes off, if possible. Eyes forward, always. Every family had legends about someone who'd broken the rules. A reckless cousin who'd sat on the forbidden sofa, a neighbor's child who'd spilled grape juice on the heirloom rug. These names were whispered like cautionary tales, and the punishments were discussed with a mixture of fear and respect. Some insisted they could still hear that person's ghost rearranging throw pillows for eternity. When gatherings ended, everyone filed out in reverse order, leaving the room untouched and undisturbed, ready to spend another year as a beautiful, expensive mirage. The door closed with a sigh, and life resumed in the mortal, washable corners of the house. So tonight, stroll through your own living room and take comfort in the freedom to sit wherever you like and drop your crumbs wherever they fall. Somewhere out there, a forbidden room slumbers, pristine, untouched, and silently judging all of us. Rich people mastered the subtle flex brilliantly. They never bragged. Instead, they mentioned things casually, softly, as if discussing the weather itself. "We took the small yacht this summer. The big one needed polishing." Everything whispered. Excessive volume belonged to people who had to pay for their own vacations. Money was never announced in elite circles. It was gently implied, woven into conversation like a silk thread you weren't supposed to notice. Except, of course, you absolutely did. You might be seated at a 12-person mahogany table with someone who owned 3 ski chalets, a vineyard, and a dog with more Instagram followers than you. But you'd never hear the word wealth spoken above a hush. Money referenced itself in code, never in currency. It began with language carefully crafted over generations. No one said, "We bought a new car." Instead, they confided, "We decided to add something German to the garage." You wouldn't hear, "My son goes to Harvard." Instead, "He's up in Cambridge rowing a bit." Mention property. And it's never "our house in Aspen." It's "we're wintering out west this year." The lodge is so peaceful after the holidays. The trick involved disguising your financial atomic bomb as a conversational snowflake. These gentle flexes weren't accidental. They represented meticulously crafted performances, passed down through generations and polished at elite boarding schools. From childhood, you learned to display only the tip of your luxury iceberg while letting others imagine the rest. Should someone accidentally let slip an actual number, dollars, square footage, anything quantifiable, the group reacted as though someone had dropped a frog into the punch bowl. Numbers were considered vulgar. Abundance should never be quantified. Complaining about privilege was itself an art form. Take vacations, for instance. Nobody simply said, "We went to the Maldives." Instead, it was a gentle sigh about the ordeal of flying commercial since the jet was being serviced, or a wistful comment about how the private beach was a bit rocky this year, but at least the staff kept the drinks cold. These weren't actually complaints. They represented stealth invitations to admire your hardship, as if dealing with an underpolished marble fountain was emotionally equivalent to losing your luggage at the bus station. Charity functions showcased another opportunity. The wealthy loved discussing giving back, but always in lowercase, murmured tones, preferably while wearing something expensive and intentionally rumpled to communicate humility. "We've just been so busy with the foundation this season," someone would say with all the weariness of a miner on a double shift. This represented a performance of self-sacrifice staged for an audience that knew precisely what the tickets had cost. Even mistakes became humble brags. The swimming pool ended up a bit too long for water polo, but perfect for morning laps. The vacation home is terribly inconvenient. One has to land the plane on the grass strip, and the chef's car can't manage the ruts. There was rhythm to it. An entire etiquette manual for how to mention your problems so listeners would know that only the truly spectacularly fortunate could have them. Children absorb this linguistic ballet from birth. The young learn to never boast, which was code for be clever about your boasting. A 6-year-old learned to say, "Nana's house is so big I get lost going to the tennis court," rather than "Nana has a mansion." As an adult, these skills sharpened into weapons as precise as any oyster fork. Break the unspoken rule by speaking too directly, displaying too much enthusiasm, or actually stating how much something cost, and the conversation stilled. A grandmother would clear her throat. Someone would stir a sugar cube into tea with the intensity of a heart surgeon. For a moment, you'd find yourself on the outside, staring in through the frosted glass of inherited etiquette. So next time you overhear the conversation about downsizing to just the one property or having to fly with the rest of the mortals, remember, the richer the person, the quieter the story. Wealth among the elite gets broadcast at a gentle whisper, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Clothing in elite circles wasn't about fashion. It was about social survival itself. Every outfit had to be appropriate for the activity, the time of day, the season, and the emotional weather of the closest matriarch. Wear the wrong shade of beige, and someone would arch an eyebrow with the force of a laser beam. Getting dressed wasn't a private affair. It was an event, a ritual, a small-scale military operation performed at dawn and reviewed by at least 2 generations of relatives. You couldn't simply throw something nice on. You required a day outfit, an afternoon change, and an evening transformation, complete with contingency plans should a surprise visitor arrive or unexpected rain disrupt the ecosystem of social harmony. The wardrobe itself functioned as an arsenal, housing clothing for every conceivable occasion, climate, and contingency. Hats lined up for walking, hats for sitting, hats for thinking somehow. Gloves filled a special drawer in 6 varieties, sorted by thickness, color, and whether they'd ever touched a doorknob. Scarves served dual purposes, functional and strategic, signaling allegiance to certain schools, clubs, or simply the prevailing color of the season, as dictated by the family oracle. Usually, this was a great aunt who'd last worn pants during Prohibition. Choosing what to wear resembled diffusing a bomb. You checked both the weather forecast and the family's emotional forecast. Was Cousin Millicent in a pastels-only mood? Was Grandma feeling avant-garde? Or had she declared, as she frequently did, that true ladies never wore yellow after Candlemas? Even the furniture in the foyer seemed to bristle if you paired winter tweed with spring cotton. Chairs upholstered in chintz eyed you suspiciously. The piano bench practically scoffed if your shoes didn't match your handbag. The real test came when you entered a room. A hush descended, heads turned, a quiet audit commenced. Someone would glance at your collar, your hem, your shoes, your jewelry, ranking you silently on an invisible scorecard of taste and class. A single fashion misstep, a visible zipper, a hat at the wrong tilt, hosiery one shade too dark, and you'd spend the entire day atoning for your sins with small talk and regret. Children learned the code early. No child appeared at breakfast in anything less than an iron shirt and shorts with a crease sharp enough to slice butter. There were dresses for lessons, uniforms for tennis, pajamas that looked better than most people's wedding attire. Before every outing there was a lineup. Mother inspecting hymns, grandmother checking for stains, the butler silently judging from the sidelines. Occasionally, rebels emerged, people who dared to wear linen out of season or arrived at a garden party in a color not approved by committee. These were the black sheep, the wild cards, the future exiles to slightly less impressive branches of the family tree. Their punishments were silent but severe. A sigh from a matriarch, a sideways glance from a patriarch, and a subtle but permanent demotion at family functions. You'd know you'd fallen from grace when your dinner seat migrated closer to the children's table. Accessories presented their own minefield. Jewelry had to be tasteful, inherited, and ideally carry a story involving a lost duchess or a dramatic escape from revolution. Shoes must always be polished. Even a scuffed heel could become tomorrow's scandal. Heaven forbid anyone forgot a handkerchief, embroidered naturally, never actually used for anything as crass as blowing one's nose. The pressure to maintain this sartorial perfection was relentless. At night, you'd undress with a sigh, slip on a monogrammed robe, and hang everything back in its rightful place, ready to repeat it all the next day. No one ever admitted how exhausting it was to live under the unblinking gaze of both ancestors and Ottomans. As you finally shed your layers and slip under the covers tonight, revel in your mismatched socks and old t-shirt. Somewhere, a brocade sofa is quietly judging you. But at least you are finally free. Having summer and winter homes wasn't about necessity. It was about ceremony, about maintaining ecosystems complete with staff, rules, and furniture that hadn't been comfortable since the Civil War. You glided between properties like a migrating bird with luggage monogrammed by God. In elite circles, the calendar was divided not by months but by migration patterns. Memorial Day didn't just signal summer's start. It triggered a logistical ballet involving wardrobes, pets, trunks, and at least one elderly relative loudly insisting that you never open the Newport house before the second week of June. By June 1st, every family member and all available help would be enlisted in the great relocation. Valets and maids packed clothing. Cooks boxed up precious preserves. Someone was inevitably dispatched to retrieve last year's forgotten tennis racket from behind a set of unused encyclopedias. Arriving at the summer house was its own event. You'd be greeted by a caretaker who'd been airing out the place since late March, which meant opening windows, cursing the raccoons, and occasionally dusting the ancestral silver. There was ceremony to stepping through those doors, inhaling the scent of old wood, mothballs, and just a hint of last season's gin. The furniture was unyielding and noble, reupholstered every decade in patterns that defied both logic and comfort. You weren't meant to relax. You were meant to respect tradition while looking picturesque doing it. Everything at the summer home had a purpose, and every purpose carried its own unspoken rules. Breakfast happened on the porch, but only if the weather and the matriarch's arthritis permitted. Garden parties took place beneath trees older than the American Constitution itself. You'd spend afternoons pretending to enjoy lawn games invented by distant English cousins, and evenings fanning yourself politely in parlors designed for neither conversation nor comfort. Winter brought its own brand of chaos. The family would decamp to the townhouse, a euphemism for a limestone fortress in the city's finest neighborhood. Here, the focus shifted to galas and dinners conducted in sitting rooms so formal you risked developing scoliosis just walking through them. The staff would reappear, remarkably unchanged from summer, but with different uniforms and stronger opinions on central heating. Everything was slightly colder, both in temperature and temperament. The fireplaces smoked. The drapes were heavy. You'd spend long evenings listening to stories about last year's blizzard and how your great-uncle once skated from the front door to the carriage house. There was a home for every season and a season for every home. Autumn meant opening the country place for hunting weekends and polite arguments about plaid. Spring brought the cottage, a misleading term for a property with its own zip code, where the gardens were judged more sternly than most political candidates. Moving between houses meant packing and repacking, losing track of heirlooms, discovering old love letters hidden behind guest room bookshelves. You'd inevitably arrive missing something essential, your favorite slippers, your dignity, or on one memorable occasion, the family patriarch, who spent an entire weekend napping undetected in the billiard room. For children, these migrations felt like magic, mixed with mild trauma. One moment, you're catching fireflies by a summer pond. The next, you're bundled in tartan, forced to greet a parade of relatives whose names all sound suspiciously like Aunt Agatha. Pets adapted by shedding on every available surface, establishing dominion across the eastern seaboard. One rule persisted regardless of house or season: never show discomfort. Complaints about drafty bedrooms, haunted attics, or furniture that squeaked in Morse code got dismissed with a wave. "It builds character," someone would say. You'd sit there shivering or sweating, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who'd made it through winters before insulation existed, and you'd pretend that switching houses every 3 months was not only reasonable, but the pinnacle of civilization. Tonight, as you nestle into your one singular, blessedly stationary home, think of the elite and their migratory rituals, forever chasing perfect weather, perfect upholstery, and the faint, fleeting sense of having arrived somewhere truly special. Emotion in elite families was considered dangerously close to being relatable. Joy was too loud, sadness too dramatic. Disappointment? Please take that to the conservatory. Every feeling had to be filtered through the gentle expression of someone politely requesting more iced tea. Emotions weren't just repressed. They were managed, redirected, and quietly refolded like yesterday's napkins. There was a certain dignity in never letting the outside world know you cared enough to feel anything at all. Happiness was permitted, but only in glancing, translucent doses, a soft smile after a particularly good bridge hand, a restrained "how lovely" upon hearing about a third grandchild. Anything more effusive risked being mistaken for enthusiasm, and enthusiasm belonged exclusively to people with student loans. Children learned early that laughter, tears, and loud sighs belonged in fiction, or at worst, the attic. Did you skin your knee during croquet? A discreet "it's nothing really" paired with a phrase about it being fine would suffice. Receive the wrong birthday present from a distant relative? The appropriate response was a grateful nod followed by a diplomatic "how thoughtful." If you felt truly overwhelmed, the powder room offered sanctuary for a few moments of facial rearrangement before returning to the drawing room with your composure reinstalled. Dinner table conversations were master classes in restraint. One mustn't exclaim, argue, or show too much interest in any subject. If you felt passionate about local politics, art, or the mystery of where the family dog disappeared every Tuesday, you channeled that energy into discussions about weather patterns. The only safe method of expressing disapproval was through a slight change in the angle of your teaspoon or a tiny strategic cough. This method was so refined that entire generations communicated their deepest feelings exclusively through utensil choreography and the frequency of their napkin adjustments. The family photograph represented perhaps the ultimate emotional test. Everyone lined up, alphabetically by height or birth order. Smiles were permitted, but never grins. Eyes could twinkle, but cheeks must remain at a neutral altitude. Someone's hand placed affectionately on a sibling's shoulder would get gently removed and repositioned at their side. If a child dared to giggle, the photographer's stern look would restore order faster than a police siren. At weddings and funerals, emotion was theoretically permitted, but still heavily regulated. Tears at a funeral were acceptable provided they were dignified and fell only on monogrammed handkerchiefs. Unrestrained weeping, that was for the help or people from other postal codes. At weddings, joy was demonstrated through subtle applause and quietly whispered toasts. Any displays of euphoria, shouts, dancing, visible happy tears risked being memorialized as a bit much in the family annals. The war on emotion extended to romance. Proposals were never flashy or overwrought. A simple, "Would you care to be my wife?" delivered at the end of a perfectly normal afternoon stroll was considered the pinnacle of passion. Love letters were composed with a focus on the weather, the roses in bloom, and one's general health, with strong feelings implied but never stated outright. Any phrase more heartfelt than "I remain, as ever, your devoted companion" was bordering on scandalous. What about anger? That was the most forbidden of all. Arguments were handled with icy politeness and a weaponized level of passive aggression. If someone truly lost their temper, it would be written into family history as an unfortunate episode, or, if they were lucky, a touch of nervous strain. Yet despite this relentless self-control, every household had tiny rebellions. A child would roll their eyes when they thought no one was looking. An aunt would let slip a laugh that rang a touch too loud. Someone would clap a bit too hard at a piano recital. These little cracks in the dam let out just enough humanity to keep the whole operation from collapsing under the weight of its own composure. So tonight, if you find yourself stifling a giggle or hiding a sniffle, remember, somewhere a great aunt is quietly adjusting her brooch, doing emotional battle on a front you can't even see. In this world, gratitude wasn't expressed with a smile. It was sent on stationery. If someone sneezed near you, congratulations. You now owed them a handwritten note on embossed cardstock. Every envelope smelled faintly of wealth, lavender, and emotional repression. The thank you note wasn't simply a polite gesture. It was a social requirement enforced with the intensity of a minor religious observance. Every family had a cupboard or drawer overflowing with thick monogrammed cards, pristine envelopes you'd hesitate to touch without gloves, and a collection of fountain pens rumored to have once belonged to obscure, well-mannered royalty. Children were initiated into this cult of correspondence before they could properly spell appreciate. As soon as they could hold a pen without poking themselves in the eye, they were set to work, scratching out thank yous for gifts, dinner parties, and the occasional smile from a passing neighbor. Writing these notes had nothing to do with conveying true emotion. It was about communicating in the dialect of upper-class etiquette, where sincerity was implied but never actually felt. The tone had to be formal, the penmanship impeccable, and the closing flourish just obsequious enough to reassure the recipient they remained at the proper level of the social pyramid. There were strict rules. Ink color, blue or black. Never red. What are you, a teacher? Margins, the appropriate length. Short notes seemed curt, long ones suspiciously enthusiastic. Perfection lived somewhere in between, like a tightrope walker over a pit of disappointed ancestors. Failure to send a thank you note, or heaven forbid to send one late, was considered a minor catastrophe. Mothers kept running lists. Grandmothers kept ledgers. The butler maintained a spreadsheet in his head of every outstanding debt of gratitude. Miss a deadline, and you could expect a phone call delivered in a tone of such disappointed politeness it would make your toes curl. Some families went so far as to assign designated thank you note days, usually rainy Sundays or the day after a major holiday, when the entire household would sit at a long table and write grim-faced until the last guest had been acknowledged and the last cheese platter properly memorialized. The most gifted writers in the family, often a spinster aunt or a retired diplomat, were revered for their skill at crafting notes that struck the perfect balance between gratitude and subtle self-congratulation. A well-written thank you note could open doors, mend fences, or secure the next coveted invitation. An awkwardly phrased one could doom you to social wilderness, or worse, earn you a spot at the children's table for the next 3 years. Thank you notes became currency traded between households like diplomatic communiques. A gift was never truly accepted until the corresponding note had arrived, delivered by post with all the solemnity of a royal decree. Some families saved them in ornate boxes organized by year and occasion, as if one day an anthropologist would arrive to study the evolution of gratitude in captivity. The cycle never ended. A note acknowledging a gift would in turn inspire a note thanking the recipient for their thoughtful response. Entire relationships seem to exist solely on paper, a gentle volley of pleasantries back and forth across decades. Somewhere in an attic, boxes of notes piled up like sediment. Each layer testified to a year's worth of birthdays, teas, and that one incident with the lemon tart that nobody was ever supposed to mention again. Tonight, drift off without the weight of a single outstanding thank you note. Savor your freedom. The stationery may be gathering dust, but at least you're off the hook. The ultimate test was accepting service while pretending you wished you didn't need it. A butler poured your tea. You had to nod solemnly as if burdened by your own privilege. Heaven forbid you looked comfortable. That would be tacky. In the rarefied air of America's elite, being served was as much a burden as a blessing. Or at least, that's what you were supposed to pretend. Service was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life so subtly it bordered on surreal. From dawn's first light, armies of staff swept through the house, polishing silver, fluffing pillows, and arranging the same vase of lilies according to preferences nobody had voiced since the Hoover administration. Your only job was to look faintly apologetic about the whole thing. Breakfast was a parade of quiet efficiency. A maid would appear with your preferred coffee, having committed your order, cream, 2 sugars, existential dread, to memory. Should you thank her? Yes, but only in the most understated tone, and never more than once per meal. Too much gratitude implied you weren't accustomed to this. Too little risked being reported to the family council. The procession of daily services continued relentlessly. Doors opened before you reached for the knob. Coats whisked away the moment your arms twitched. Fireplaces lit before the first hint of a shiver. If you ever found yourself thinking you could have done that yourself, you'd be correct. You'd never say it aloud, though. In these circles, insisting on self-sufficiency was almost as grave as using the wrong fork at dinner. At social gatherings, the choreography intensified dramatically. The butler's arrival with tea became a miniature performance. You watched the delicate arc of hot liquid filling your cup, trying not to let your eyes linger on the scone in case hunger looked unrefined. When the sugar bowl was presented, you'd hesitate for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to show humility, not so long as to suggest indecision. Accept a biscuit, but never the first one on the plate. Refuse a second helping unless cajoled. Above all, project the sense that you'd be just as content with a chipped mug and a quiet moment alone, despite the fact that both were strictly forbidden. There was an invisible code for interacting with staff. Names were to be remembered but never spoken too familiarly. You should know the difference between the underfootman and the third footman, but never draw attention to the fact. If someone new arrived, a temp, a cousin filling in for the summer, your job was to appear to barely notice, offering a polite nod that said both welcome and please do not address me unless the house is on fire. The greatest skill of all was concealing any joy or ease that service provided. Sink too comfortably into a freshly fluffed chair, and you'd catch the matriarch's eye, reminding you that no comfort is best displayed on a bed of mild discomfort. Compliment the butler's table setting, and you risked being asked to judge the silver polish, an ordeal for which no one is truly prepared. Ask a maid about her weekend, and you'd be quietly redirected to the weather or the houseplants or anything less controversial than the possibility that your staff had inner lives. When guests were present, the performance escalated into competitive sport. Whose water glass would be refilled first? Whose napkin would be folded into a more elaborate swan? Through it all, guests must look almost burdened by the luxury, grateful but never indulgent, demonstrating that true class meant being served while never appearing to savor it. As you survived another day of careful deference and faux discomfort, you learned the great paradox of privilege. Comfort must be worn like an old suit, well-tailored, barely acknowledged, and never mistaken for actual pleasure. Tonight, as you tuck yourself in, perhaps with your own two hands, know this: comfort you provide for yourself is the sweetest kind, and you're allowed to enjoy every second of it. Elite charity wasn't about helping others. It was about quietly proving your moral superiority while wearing diamonds the size of rosary beads. You'd sip champagne while discussing the plight of the less fortunate, all while standing under a chandelier that cost more than a starter home. Charity events in elite circles were a dazzling paradox, equal parts benevolence and ballet, with everyone moving in slow choreographed circles designed to showcase not just their goodwill, but their taste, wit, and ability to wear vintage couture without sweating. Invitations arrived weeks in advance, often hand-delivered on creamy stationery that felt heavier than some people's mortgages. The guest list was a who's who of everyone you'd ever felt slightly intimidated by, oil magnates to socialites with 3 last names. Preparation for these soirees was itself a competitive sport. Hair appointments booked months ahead, gowns pressed and laid out, tuxedos aired and inspected for signs of rebellion. A rogue thread, an outdated lapel. The pre-event conversations alone could last hours. Would Mrs. Forsyte's sapphires outshine the guest of honor's emeralds? Would the orchestra play too much Strauss again? Everyone in attendance knew the true agenda: do good, look better, and, if possible, secure a mention in the society pages. Once you arrived, the first hurdle was the silent check-in. You didn't simply walk in. You were greeted at the door by a committee of smiles so polished they could cut glass, then whisked into a receiving line that seemed designed to remind you of every name you'd ever mispronounced. Small talk was a blood sport. You complimented a dress, praised a speech, offered subtle nods that said, "Yes, I'm as generous as I am tasteful." Drinks flowed, and so did the compliments. Effortless, strategic, quietly barbed. The true aficionados played the long game. They donated enough to get their name in the glossy event program, but not so much as to seem desperate. Anonymity was an art form. The phrase "anonymous benefactor" was code for everyone knows, but let's pretend to be humble. The evening's centerpiece was the auction. Competition escalated dramatically. Bids were made with a casual flick of a paddle or the raise of a well-manicured eyebrow. One-upmanship disguised as generosity. "I suppose I could use another painting for the solarium," someone would sigh moments before placing a bid large enough to fund a small opera company. Silent auctions were no less cutthroat. Monogrammed pens hovered above bid sheets, and it wasn't unheard of for a friendly elbow to nudge out a rival for that antique crystal decanter. But it wasn't only about what you gave, it was how you gave. The very best made it look effortless, as if parting with a substantial sum was no more significant than picking a new shade of wallpaper. Every gesture was calibrated. The hand on the checkbook, the smile at the philanthropist across the room, the sympathetic sigh at the mention of hardship abroad, all performed with the subtlety of a matinee idol. There was prestige in knowing you'd made a difference, especially if everyone else knew it too. For all its theater, charity events did some good, just never as much as the after-party gossip would claim. Money was raised, checks were written, speeches were applauded with the right amount of fervor. Then, as the evening wound down and the last glass of champagne was drained, guests filtered out under the chandelier, pausing to retrieve designer coats and sometimes a parting gift bag worth more than your monthly rent. The next day, photos appeared in society magazines. Faces glowed, jewels sparkled. Captions were heavy with praise for the generosity and spirit of our city's most distinguished citizens. Behind closed doors, invitations for next year's gala were already being drafted, with careful notes about who donated how much, who wore what, and most crucially, who cried the prettiest during the closing remarks. Walking into a room was a ritual you couldn't rush, hesitate over, or botch. You had to glide smoothly, confidently, like someone who'd never paid an overdraft fee in their entire life. Your entrance wasn't about you. It was about reassuring everyone else that the social hierarchy was still intact. Before even touching the doorknob, you'd mentally rehearsed your posture, expression, and the gentle rhythm of your footsteps. This was no place for hesitation. To pause or linger in the hallway risked looking uncertain, a fate worse than mismatched cufflinks. You began by adjusting your clothing, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, checking your reflection in the nearest piece of antique silver, making sure your shoes didn't squeak. Then, with all the calm of a reigning monarch, you stepped through the door at exactly the right moment. Timing was everything. Too early and you seemed desperate. Too late and you were making an entrance which was only permitted if you were a matriarch or had donated a new wing to the hospital. Inside, you held your head high. Not too high, lest you look haughty, but never low enough to suggest self-doubt. Your eyes scanned the room just enough to acknowledge the power players, but not enough to appear as if you were searching for someone to sit with at lunch. The trick was to look as if every person in the room was both a dear friend and a distant subordinate. Unspoken rules governed body language. Shoulders relaxed, but never drooping. Hands at your sides unless holding a drink, in which case you cradled the glass as if it were a Fabergé egg. Confident elites never fidgeted. They seemed to float, propelled by generations of inherited grace and well-tailored clothing. If you caught someone's eye, you offered a nod. Subtle, dignified, the kind of greeting that said, "I see you, and I will remember you when I'm rewriting my will." Greeting your host was a ritual within a ritual. You approached with measured steps, a smile that was equal parts warmth and restraint. The handshake, if offered, should be firm but brief, with the palm ever so slightly upturned, a gesture historically associated with both peace and the expectation of tribute. Compliments were issued in a controlled tone. "What a beautiful gathering," or "Your home looks as stunning as ever." No gushing. Gushing belonged to people who hadn't learned to appear effortlessly bored by perfection. You were always aware of your audience. Even if no one was watching, they were. You walked as though being quietly evaluated by a committee of ants. If you traversed the room, you did so at an unhurried pace, resisting the urge to check your phone or dart into a safe corner. Every step signaled that you belonged here, had always belonged here, and would continue to belong long after the seating chart changed. The true connoisseur of entrances knew the value of subtlety. You never drew attention. Instead, you cultivated an aura, part mystery, part authority, part mild amusement at the whole charade. If your entrance was noticed, it was for all the right reasons. People felt reassured by your presence, as if order had returned and the punchline to some ancient family joke was now safe in your hands. Should you ever falter, stumble on the rug, get caught in the crosshairs of a particularly chatty cousin, or enter just as someone finished telling a story about your childhood mishaps, your best defense was a wry smile and the gentle art of deflection. What a remarkable carpet, you might say, as if the house itself had conspired to trip you. Tonight, as you walk from kitchen to living room, perhaps in pajamas and socks, remember, you don't need to own the economy to enter a room with confidence. Sometimes the grandest entrance is the one where you simply feel at home. Family portraits weren't snapshots, they were negotiations. Every person had a designated place based on age, wealth, power, and who had offended the matriarch most recently. Smiling too widely was a sign of weakness. Smiling too little made you troublesome. The photographer arrives, a professional naturally, with an accent that cost extra. The family assembles in the grandest room available, one with just the right balance of ancestral oil paintings and awkwardly looming taxidermy. It's time for the annual portrait, an event less about immortalizing love and more about reaffirming the pecking order. There's choreography to the whole process, but instead of dance, it's an intricate whispered debate. Grandparents command throne-like armchairs. Parents are grouped close by, angled toward the lens for maximum generational impact. Children are marshaled into the foreground, each instructed to look cherubic, but not competitive. Any hint of rivalry warrants a private word later. Adult siblings jostle for middle ground, visible but not blocking the legacy faces, while the family's most recently acquired in-law hovers somewhere near the periphery, smiling bravely in the face of existential uncertainty. Outfits are selected with military precision. No two patterns clash. No hemline threatens scandal, and the color palette must flatter not only skin tones, but the prevailing shade of the antique wallpaper. Accessories are scrutinized carefully. Brooches are allowed if they belong to an ancestor, but nothing so bold as to upstage the patriarch's tie. The result is a tableau that looks coordinated, but never too eager. A subtle message to posterity that these people understood both restraint and the power of a well-timed silk scarf. Then comes the most important decision: seating. This isn't mere logistics. It's psychological warfare. Who stands beside whom? Which cousin gets banished to the back row? Whose place on the edge hints at some yet unspoken family drama? To the uninitiated, it's just a group photo. To the participants, it's the Game of Thrones with less violence and more pearls. The photographer attempts levity, making gentle jokes or asking everyone to say cheese. This gets met with the strained amusement you'd find at a royal wake. A smile must be natural but not toothy. Just a hint of mirth, as if everyone's sharing a private joke about capital gains. Eyes should be open but not wide, alert but not desperate, Any sign of joy must fit the collective emotional temperature of the moment. Children threaten to derail everything. The youngest wriggle, the oldest sulk. Somewhere a toddler is seconds from launching a bow into the fireplace. Mothers hiss threats through their teeth. Fathers offer bribes of forbidden dessert. The matriarch simply fixes the room with a stare so powerful that the mere thought of fidgeting fades away. Sometimes the family dog or a particularly photogenic cat gets invited in, carefully brushed and positioned for maximum symbolism. Pets are a wild card, but a necessary one. Their presence softens the tableau, suggesting a family so secure that even the spaniel knows its place. When the camera finally clicks, everyone holds their breath, muscles tensed in a display of unity and quiet discomfort. After the shot, there's a collective sigh, a scramble to remove scratchy jackets, and the immediate disbanding into smaller, less regimented groups. Later, the chosen photograph gets framed and placed in the hall, a monument to order, legacy, and unspoken alliances. Visitors will comment on the family's resemblance, the serenity in their eyes, never knowing the scene was brokered like a peace treaty and enforced with the silent pressure of 150 years of tradition. Tonight, as you scroll through your own messy phone photos, remember, a little chaos, a lopsided grin, and someone's thumb in the frame might be the truest portrait of all, and no one has to negotiate where you stand. Inheritance wasn't just money, it was a full-contact sport. Every cousin, aunt, and distant relative became a player, elbowing for position within a complicated financial Hunger Games. You'd spend holidays casually wondering which antique vase would be yours if everyone else mysteriously disappeared. The first rule of inheritance politics was never to talk about inheritance politics, at least not openly. Discussions of the will were slipped into conversation with the subtlety of a foghorn. Your grandfather always loved that clock, you know. Or, I do hope Aunt Lydia remembers who actually dusted these candlesticks last Christmas. These gentle reminders served a dual purpose, preserving family harmony on the surface while fanning the flames of competitive anticipation beneath. Every holiday or family gathering was an audition. Children practiced their manners with monastic discipline. Adults offered unsolicited help in the garden, the library, or anywhere an aging benefactor might be lurking. That spontaneous display of filial piety was calculated. The artful compliment about a hideous oil painting was pure strategy. Nothing happened by accident when the next codicil was rumored to be in progress. Wills, when mentioned, were shrouded in mystery and myth. Somewhere in a bank vault, the current matriarch's last testament sat like a literary thriller. Its contents were the subject of feverish speculation, with entire family branches devising theories about who would inherit the summer house, the stocks, or the terrifyingly lifelike portrait of Great Uncle Horace. If you were lucky, you'd be left something tasteful, perhaps a diamond brooch or set of silverware. If unlucky, you'd inherit responsibilities such as managing the crumbling ancestral estate or paying the taxes on a stamp collection no one could locate. Siblings became competitors in this delicate game. Rivalries simmered for decades, hidden behind polite greetings and perfectly wrapped gifts. Every generous act was scrutinized for motive. Did Cousin George really help clean out the attic out of goodness, or was he searching for that rumored Fabergé egg? Did Aunt Beatrice invite the whole family to the seaside because she cherished togetherness, or because she wanted one last chance to influence the distribution of the good china. The matriarch or patriarch reigned supreme in this dynasty of deferred dreams. Their health became the family's favorite topic. Everyone wanted them to live forever, but not so long as to spend down the principal. When an heir apparent fell out of favor, perhaps by marrying someone from the wrong zip code or voicing a controversial opinion about the wallpaper, they were quietly demoted, their name penciled down the list, replaced by a more compliant or photogenic sibling. Occasionally, the reading of a will became an event staged with the drama of a season finale. The family gathered in a paneled study, nerves disguised as curiosity, as the lawyer cleared his throat and began. There were always surprises, fortunes left to cats, jewels donated to museums. Summer homes split into fractions so minuscule the only thing shared was resentment. Someone inevitably received a token of affection, which was code for "you're lucky to get anything." The best you could hope for was a slice of dignity and maybe a fondue set. Afterwards, alliances shifted. Old wounds were reopened. The true legacy of inheritance emerged. Stories of family feuds, disputed bequests, and the ancient scandal involving a missing tiara and a runaway governess. But somehow, life resumed. The next holiday arrived, the dining table filled, and the game began again, this time with fresh competitors and new antiques to covet. Tonight, as you look around your own home, maybe at a chipped mug or an inherited quilt, remember, real legacy isn't measured in vases or property lines. It's in the memories, the laughter, and the wild hope that one day you might inherit the only thing that truly matters, a family story worth telling. In America's elite circles, apologies were an elaborate dance crafted, delivered, and then immediately retracted with a gentle laugh and a fresh cup of tea. "I'm terribly sorry you were offended," became the go-to phrase, which was code for "I regret nothing, but here's a napkin with my initials on it." Sincerity was optional. Etiquette was everything. It all started with a social misstep. Perhaps a comment made a little too loudly at a garden party, or the accidental usurpation of a parking spot meant for someone with a surname ending in Roman numerals. In most circles, you'd simply say sorry and move on. But in the world of silk wallpaper and inherited brooches, apology was a fine art, a carefully scripted performance honed over generations and best delivered while sitting very straight on an uncomfortable settee. The first step in the elite apology was deflection. Acknowledging actual fault was reserved for the truly catastrophic, like stepping on the family dog or accidentally auctioning off the wrong wing of the house. Most apologies began with the classic non-apology. "I'm so sorry if there was any misunderstanding." This phrase was the Swiss Army knife of regret, adaptable to any occasion and guaranteed to absolve the apologizer of all wrongdoing. Tone was everything. An apology in these circles was offered in soothing, melodious notes. Never rushed, never urgent, always paired with an offer of refreshment. "I hope you'll forgive me" was often accompanied by a delicate biscuit or a refill of tea, as though sugar could dissolve awkwardness. For more egregious offenses, a spilled glass of red wine on the Persian rug, for example, there was a slightly more serious iteration. "Please accept my deepest regrets for the unfortunate incident." Still, guilt was never truly admitted, merely observed like a distant ship passing in the night. The next step was distraction. Change the subject quickly but politely, perhaps to the weather or the tragic state of the roses. If done with finesse, the wronged party would find themselves discussing rainfall totals or next season's social calendar, momentarily forgetting whatever slight had just occurred. Bonus points were awarded if you could work in a gentle compliment. "You always wear blue so well, dear. I do hope I didn't ruin your evening." The wronged party, suddenly cast as a fashion icon, might even thank you for your thoughtfulness. Physical tokens sometimes sweetened the deal. A carefully chosen bouquet, a box of imported chocolates. For more serious matters, a personalized note on heavy monogrammed stationery. These gestures didn't imply guilt. They simply reminded the recipient of the apologizer's good breeding. The note was especially key, never too effusive, never too brief, always hand-delivered so the staff could bear witness to your magnanimity. Timing was crucial. One must apologize neither too soon nor too late. An immediate apology could suggest panic or worse, real remorse. An overly delayed one risked seeming dismissive. The ideal window was roughly the time it takes to prepare a second pot of tea, just long enough to seem considered, not so long as to appear calculated. Occasionally, if tensions lingered, a third party, usually a matriarch or a well-placed family friend, would step in to broker peace. This was done through a roundabout conversation over bridge or croquet, with gentle reminders that we all have our little foibles. By the end, everyone would have apologized for something, even if nobody quite remembered what it was. And so life in elite circles moved on. Misunderstandings smoothed over with etiquette and embroidered napkins, guilt gracefully sidestepped, relationships restored without anyone ever uttering the words, "I was wrong." Tonight, as you reflect on your own awkward moments, remember, sometimes the art of apology is less about saying sorry and more about never quite admitting you were the one at fault in the first place. And if all else fails, offer tea. It works wonders. The front lawn was never just grass. It was a silent resume, a green battlefield where status was measured in inches. Lawns were clipped with military precision, and flower beds were micromanaged by committees of professional gardeners, and at least one retired colonel with strong opinions about roses. Let one dandelion bloom, and the neighbors would whisper for weeks. Each spring signaled not just the return of robins, but the beginning of the lawn games. Overnight, the quiet lanes of the elite transformed into an arena where fortunes and reputations rose and fell with the health of hydrangeas and the symmetry of boxwoods. Homeowners who never so much as wielded a rake themselves issued detailed instructions to their legions of gardeners, referencing historical records and occasionally the writings of Capability Brown. Schedules were drawn up with the intensity of a military campaign. Monday for edging, Tuesday for aeration, or Wednesday for the ritual scattering of grass seed approved by both the local garden society and, allegedly, Queen Victoria herself. There were rules for mowing, always at a diagonal, never straight up and down. Watering before sunrise for maximum smugness. Fertilizing organic only, unless the neighbors went synthetic first. Every aspect of the lawn was fair game for scrutiny. Grass was expected to be so uniform it resembled billiard felt, emerald green, lush, and thick enough to induce jealousy in professional athletes. Heaven help you if your lawn suffered the ignominy of brown patches or worse, a clump of crabgrass. Such offenses led to late-night conferences at garden gates and subtle pitying glances over the topiaries. Flower beds were their own highly competitive league. Nothing was left to chance. Seasonal blooms were chosen for maximum impact, carefully timed so the garden was never without color or fragrance. Tulips gave way to peonies, which in turn yielded to roses, all orchestrated in a crescendo of scent and hue. New plants were whispered about before being planted. Have you heard the Freemans are trying blue delphiniums this year? A statement that could either mean admiration or the first step toward social exile. The crowning jewel was the lawn ornamentation. Statues, bird baths, and sundials appeared and disappeared, according to the whims of both fashion and personal rivalry. The bravest families entered the annual garden tour, an event so charged with underlying competition it made the Olympic Games look like a friendly picnic. This was where the true hierarchy of the neighborhood was revealed, not through conversation, but by whose hydrangeas survived the late frost and whose beds were mulched to perfection. Children were enlisted in the cause, drafted into weed patrol and daffodil duty. Every family had stories of a beloved spaniel that disgraced itself on the neighbor's manicured lawn, or a cousin who mowed too close to the prize irises and was never invited back. Dogs learned quickly to tiptoe along designated paths or face exile to the back garden, but perhaps the most fearsome player was the retired military man down the lane who patrolled with a clipboard, issuing both advice and veiled threats. "Your edging is looking a little ragged, Mrs. Ashbury. Shall I lend you my shears?" was a question with no correct answer, except, and you admitted defeat. Decline, and your lawn would be the subject of subtle sabotage for months. The season reached its crescendo with the neighborhood fete, where prizes were awarded for best rows, straightest hedges, and most original display. Winners took home grave trowels. Losers took home resolve to try harder. Everyone took home stories of the year's great victories and tragic defeats. Tonight, as you gaze upon your own patch of grass, be it a tidy yard or a wild tangle, remember, sometimes a single dandelion is an act of rebellion. In the world of elite lawns, survival often means knowing when to let it grow. Formal dinner presented challenges that casual meals never had. You weren't allowed to eat like a normal person. Tiny, silent bites had to accompany vigorous eye contact with strangers named Huntington. Bread rolls were torn, never bitten. Soup was sipped, never slurped. Joy was optional. Stepping into the dining room for a formal meal felt less like entering a place of nourishment and more like taking your place at a diplomatic summit, if the diplomats were armed with monogrammed silver and a deep ancestral fear of audible chewing. Each seat was assigned with place cards rendered in copperplate script that dared you to sit in the wrong spot. The table itself stretched to distant horizons, draped in starched linen. Its surface groaning under so much cutlery, you wondered whether anyone might perform minor surgery between courses. Your first challenge involved determining which bread plate was yours or your neighbor's. Whispered mnemonics existed for this: left for bread, right for drink. But woe betide the guest who reached the wrong way and instigated a silent, buttery turf war. Once secured, your bread roll was not to be bitten, but delicately torn into smaller pieces, each one buttered with the appropriate knife as if conducting a sacred rite. The only thing forbidden more strictly than biting straight into a roll was apparently being seen enjoying it. The soup course became a battleground of etiquette. The soup spoon, never to be confused with a dessert spoon, for that was social exile, had to be dipped away from the body and sipped in monastic silence. Slurping was grounds for a scandal that could echo through generations. If the soup was too hot, you waited. If it was too cold, you smiled. If it was made from something unrecognizable, turtle, perhaps, or some vegetable never seen outside French cuisine, you quietly persevered, sipping and nodding at the host's culinary ambition. Conversation during dinner represented another Olympic event. You were expected to make small talk, never about money, politics, or actual feelings, with the guest to your right during the first course and the guest to your left for the second. Switching conversational partners mid-course was as taboo as switching forks. You asked questions, but not too many, and answered without oversharing. If someone mentioned their recent trip to Europe, you responded with a knowing smile and a comment about the weather in Paris, regardless of whether you'd ever left the state. The main course presented its own challenges. Portions arrived artfully minuscule, arranged in architectural stacks that dared you to dismantle them. Knife and fork choreography was strictly observed. You had to cut no more than one bite at a time. Anything more suggested haste, gluttony, or a working-class upbringing. If you finished your course early, you waited, with hands politely folded, resisting the primal urge to lick your plate or drum your fingers on the tablecloth. Then there were the minefields of wine pairings and glassware, the water goblet, the red wine glass, the white wine glass. Each had its proper place, and heaven help you if you confuse them. Should you accidentally pick up the wrong glass, the protocol was to pretend you hadn't, setting it down with the practiced nonchalance of someone who'd never made a mistake in their life. Dessert was both a relief and a final test. Spoons and forks of unique shapes arrived, each suited for a specific confection. Pastries were dissected with surgical precision, and fruit was consumed with the air of someone reviewing a legal document. If cheese was served, it came with its own implements, and questions about origins or rind were a chance to display just enough curiosity, not so much as to reveal ignorance. By the time coffee arrived, most guests were exhausted. Plates were cleared in silent, synchronized waves. As you pushed back from the table, you realized you had survived not just a meal, but a test of endurance, subtlety, and jaw control. Dogs in elite households weren't pets. They were aristocrats with fur. They ate better than most humans, slept on embroidered cushions, and understood more about generational wealth than you did. From the moment you entered a grand estate, it became clear the dog wasn't just part of the family. It was practically the head of a minor branch of the family tree. You'd see them first, reclining in the front hall, their collars a tapestry of stitched monograms and possibly the odd gemstone. These dogs didn't fetch. They summoned. They didn't bark. They issued polite, slightly disappointed coughs, the kind you'd expect from a headmaster at a private school. Feeding time was an event unto itself. The family chef prepared custom meals, the sort of delicate fare most humans would have to reserve months ahead to taste. Chicken poached in filtered water, carrots cut into decorative rosettes, a biscuit that, if the rumors were true, was flown in from France. Suggest canned food or, heaven forbid, kibble, and you'd receive the sort of withering stare typically reserved for people who ask for ketchup at a steakhouse. The dog's bed was less a sleeping space and more a curated exhibit of textile history. Hand-embroidered cushions, heirloom quilts, Even the odd cashmere throw were arranged just so, providing the dog with an array of options. Occasionally, the animal might deign to nap in the sunroom or sprawl across a fainting couch, further rearranging the pillows to suit its ever-evolving aesthetic. Everyone understood the hierarchy. You adjusted your seating, not the dog. Exercise routines were conducted with military precision. Walks were more like promenades attended by a staff member whose main job was to carry a parasol and make polite conversation with passing neighbors. If the family had grounds, and of course they did, the dog had its own mapped territory, special lawns for romping, a particular set of steps just for contemplating the state of things. If feeling adventurous, a private pond for supervised splashing. Sometimes the family would throw a party just for the dog's birthday, complete with a cake from a renowned patisserie and an exclusive guest list that definitely excluded the cat. No one talked baby talk to these dogs. Instead, conversations were calm, measured, and contained just a hint of negotiation. Would Madam like to stroll before luncheon or after? The butler might inquire, leash in hand. When guests arrived, the dog performed a brief inspection, sniffing shoes and assessing the worthiness of visitors. Children were allowed to play, provided they remembered the cardinal rule: the dog chooses you, never the other way around. The dog's medical care rivaled that of minor royalty. Annual checkups with the most discreet and well-connected veterinarians, grooming sessions that lasted longer than some debutante balls. If the animal had an ailment, herbal poultices and homeopathic remedies were sourced from distant relatives or expensive catalogs. The family scrapbook held entire pages dedicated to generations of canine companions, their lineage more meticulously tracked than most European prinklings. Sometimes dogs even figured in the family will, portraits immortalized in oil paint, wearing little jackets, seated regally on ancestral armchairs, staring into the middle distance as if pondering property taxes. There were stories of fortunes left to beloved pups, with distant relations forced to care for a schnauzer or risk losing access to a trust fund. If you think that's far-fetched, you haven't spent enough time around people who believe a Labrador can have a favorite stockbroker. At the end of the day, the dog retired to its favorite nook, perhaps with a velvet rope draped casually across the entrance, a sign to everyone: do not disturb, napping in progress. The family would tiptoe past, lowering their voices lest they interrupt an afternoon of dignified snoring. Nothing was safe from initials in wealthy circles. Towels monogrammed, slippers monogrammed, the family toothbrush holder probably monogrammed. Identity wasn't something you carried. It was something you stamped onto fabric until it lost the will to resist. Beginning in the linen closet, that hallowed vault of the upper crust, you'd find shelves stacked with towels so plush they could double as duvets, each embroidered with elaborate intertwined letters. A silent code that these hands have never touched a bargain bin. Every family member had their own set. Master towels for the parents, hand towels for the children, guest towels for the lucky few deemed worthy of wiping their hands on luxury. Occasionally, a house guest, unsure which set was theirs, would stand paralyzed, afraid to touch anything, lest they accidentally dry off with a towel intended for a minor viscount. The monogramming extended far beyond towels. Bed linens, napkins, pillowcases, all bore the family cipher. Even the picnic blankets for the garden had their own set of initials, just in case someone attempted a surreptitious swap at the croquet match. Slippers and robes were stitched with such precision that even if you lost your way in a sprawling country house, you could follow the trail of initials back to your bedroom like a particularly tasteful breadcrumb trail. Wardrobes were another battlefield. Handkerchiefs, socks, and scarves all displayed the mark of ownership, subtle but unmistakable. The logic seemed to be, if it can be dropped, loaned, or stolen, it should bear the family brand. Even pets weren't exempt. Collars, leads, and, rumor had it, miniature monogrammed raincoats ensured that if the spaniel wandered onto the neighbor's estate, everyone would know exactly whose privilege it was flaunting. But monogramming wasn't just about possession, it was about heritage. Each design was a family heirloom in itself, with styles passed down like secret recipes. There were debates, sometimes fierce, over fonts and thread colors. Should the initials be italic or block, gold thread or navy, triple shadowed or elegantly understated? There were tales of entire family meetings derailed by the controversial choice of a serif. Special occasions prompted monogramming sprees. The birth of a child warranted a flurry of customized bibs, bonnets, and blankets, lest the infant develop an identity crisis before their first solid food. Engagements unleashed a storm of new bathrobes, tea towels, and, most crucially, the merging of initials into one decorative cipher, an art form rivaling heraldry. Weddings called for hand-stitched table runners and enough engraved napkin rings to outfit a small army. The ultimate flex was the monogrammed travel accessory. Luggage emblazoned with curling gold letters made its own statement at the train station or pier. Yes, that trunk is ours. Yes, it requires 2 porters. No, it does not contain anything as vulgar as mass-produced soap. Even the smallest items bore the mark. Playing cards, tennis racket covers, cigar cases. Should an object pass out of the family's hands, it would always carry a tiny piece of its history with it. This obsession extended to the home's fixtures, door knockers, letterboxes, even the family silver, all monogrammed. Dinner parties featured place cards hand-lettered with individual crests. The family Bible, if it could have been monogrammed, would have been. What did it all mean? On one level, it was simple. Nothing says, "we belong," quite like a towel embroidered with the same script your great-grandfather used to sign checks. But on a deeper level, monogramming was a declaration that you, your ancestors, and your linens were all part of a story that deserved to be told, initial by initial, generation by generation. Tonight, as you dry your hands on an unmarked towel or slip into anonymous pajamas, take a moment to imagine a world where every possession quietly announces its place in the lineage. Then smile and remember, the only monogram you really need is the one you leave on the world one day at a time. Being wealthy meant attending a school where children learned etiquette, Latin, and the art of quietly judging others. Dorms were chilly, halls were drafty, and everyone pretended to enjoy fencing. To outsiders, boarding school might have sounded like a perpetual adventure. Endless sleepovers, midnight feasts, and the forging of lifelong friendships beneath creaky rafters and ancient portraits. In reality, it was an elaborate theater of tradition, hierarchy, and, if you were lucky, just enough scandal to keep things interesting. The rules started early and multiplied quickly. There was a right way to make your bed. Hospital corners, naturally. A correct order for lacing your shoes. Precise etiquette for the breakfast queue. You quickly learned that oatmeal could be a weapon, and that making eye contact with the head prefect before noon was best avoided. Breakfast itself was a marathon of silent suffering, lukewarm eggs, a surly housemaster, classmates who could recite Virgil but apparently not basic table manners. Dress codes were taken to dizzying heights. Uniforms weren't merely required, they were policed with the zeal of a small dictatorship. Socks must match, ties must be properly knotted. Heaven help anyone caught with a rogue earring or worse, a skirt more than half an inch above regulation. School blazers were so stiff they could stand without a wearer, carrying a scent of mothballs and suppressed dreams. Even on casual days, the underlying expectation was that casual meant ready for a state visit. Academics, too, were shrouded in a sense of historical weight. Latin wasn't optional. French was for those who wanted to travel. Greek was for those who wanted to feel superior. Mathematics involved equations that would never appear in real life, but were apparently vital to character development. And then there was fencing, ostensibly a sport, but really a highly structured way to let out centuries of family tension with swords too blunt to do real damage. The hierarchy among students was rigid and transparent. Prefects, head boys and girls, and form monitors patrolled the halls, armed with clipboards and an uncanny ability to detect whispered gossip from 3 floors away. First years learned to blend into the background. Second years aspired to become monitors. The upper forms held court at the back of the library, dispensing cryptic advice and occasionally contraband sweets. Rituals abounded everywhere. Chapel every morning, hymn books included, enthusiasm optional, roll call at ungodly hours. The endless cycle of intramural competitions, debate, rowing, chess, and the ever-popular see who can look the most bored during visiting weekend. The prize? A silver cup and a grudging nod from the headmaster. The buildings themselves seemed designed to keep you humble. Dormitories were always a few degrees too cold. Windows rattled in every breeze. The plumbing delivered water with all the enthusiasm of a scolded butler. Showers required planning. Towels, always monogrammed naturally, never dried properly. The echo of footsteps in the hall after curfew was both comforting and terrifying, as was the distant creak of a matron on patrol. Perhaps the main lesson wasn't academic, athletic, or even disciplinary. It was social. Students learned to navigate shifting alliances, decode the ever-changing landscape of acceptability, and most importantly, mask their vulnerabilities beneath layers of polite indifference. Friendships were forged in fire drills and lost in the fog of rumor. Everyone had a nickname, and stories of pranks, both real and apocryphal, grew in the telling until even the headmaster began to seem like a character in a Gothic novel. Yet for all the posturing and protocol, boarding school offered moments of genuine connection. Whispered secrets after lights out, snowball fights in the quad, the unspoken camaraderie of survivors. Years later, you'd recognize the twinkle in the eye of a fellow alumnus across a crowded room, a knowing look that said, yes, we survived the rules, the Latin, and the fencing. Twice a year, clothing was shifted between closets with the solemnity of a religious festival. Wool traveled to storage, linen returned from exile. You were expected to care deeply about fabrics in a way no sane person does. This was no simple spring cleaning. The biannual wardrobe migration was a multi-generational spectacle of planning, opinion, and emotional turmoil, all conducted in service of proper seasonal attire. The date was chosen as carefully as a coronation, never too soon, risking ridicule from the neighbors, and never too late, lest someone catch you in tweed after the equinox. Weather was watched obsessively, and the first mild breeze would set the household on high alert. Fetch the cedar chests, Millicent, it's happening. Preparation began in the attics and cellars, where trunks the size of small submarines were unearthed. Inside, mothballs jostled with the ghosts of last year's parties. Gloves, scarves, and hats, each nestled in its own tissue paper cocoon, were appraised like family jewels. Children were conscripted into service, given the sacred task of carrying piles of sweaters up and down stairs. Their reward? The privilege of being told they were doing it wrong. Each garment was subject to a level of scrutiny normally reserved for works of art. Wool was examined for mysterious holes. Blame was assigned, often retroactively, to long-deceased moths. Cashmere was caressed with the same reverence one might show a holy relic. Linen, on the other hand, was approached with a mixture of delight and terror. Delight at the thought of summer's freedom, terror at the prospect of ironing. The iron itself, a cast-iron monster inherited from an era before ergonomic handles, stood ready for hours of battle. The Great Migration was overseen by a committee of elders, and unofficially every piece of furniture in the hallway. Chairs were pressed into duty as temporary display racks. Beds vanished beneath mountains of color-coded garments. Dogs and small children disappeared, only to re-emerge later swaddled in scarves and trailing ribbons. The process was more than logistical. It was deeply emotional. Out came the summer dresses and straw hats, carrying memories of garden parties, near sunburns, and awkward picnics with distant cousins. Into storage went the heavy coats and woolen socks, along with tales of snowball fights, holiday dinners, and the year Aunt Augusta fell on the ice and blamed her shoes for being too new. Each folded button brought a wave of nostalgia, quickly replaced by a flurry of debate over whether capes were back in fashion or if this was finally the year to donate that paisley waistcoat. Of course, there were rules. Anything not worn in the last season was given a stern talking to before being passed to charity, or in some tragic cases, to a cousin with fewer scruples about fashion. Items for country use only were demoted to the farthest reaches of the closet, where they'd gather dust and resentment until next year's migration. If an item had sentimental value, it was wrapped and rewrapped, sometimes with a handwritten note, as if it might need to explain itself to future generations. The final act was the grand unveiling, opening the closet doors and displaying the newly installed garments for all to admire. Matriarchs inspected every hanger, offering both praise and constructive criticism. "A little snug in the shoulders, dear, but you'll grow into it, or out of it, depending on the cook's mood this summer." Shoes were polished, hats were fluffed. Everything was made ready for whatever society or the weather demanded. By evening, the house had returned to normal. The wool slumbered in darkness. The linen basked in the glory of the front closet. The family, exhausted but triumphant, settled in to recover with lemonade or hot cocoa, depending on the season. Peace, however temporary, had been restored. Tonight, as you throw on whatever's closest to hand, unbothered by the judgment of scarves, remember, somewhere a linen suit dreams of summer, and a wool coat is already plotting its next escape. Names were never mere labels in elite circles. They were complex social signals, verbal secret handshakes that determined who belonged and who was merely passing through. The uninitiated could lose entire afternoons just trying to untangle introductions at a garden party. You might overhear a conversation like, quote 7, to which someone would nod knowingly, as if this all made perfect sense in their world. It was utterly bewildering to anyone else observing the exchange. It started with the sheer proliferation of titles. There were so many variations, Mrs., Miss, Mr., but also the curious sprinkling of familial ranks, aunt, uncle, cousin, first, second, or removed so many times no one remembered the original connection. Add to this honorary titles earned through charitable boards, church committees, or simply surviving 3 debutante seasons without a scandal. Some names came with suffixes, senior, junior, the third, trailing along like little status flags that everyone was supposed to notice. Woe betide the dinner guest who addressed Mrs. Weatherby as Helen, or heaven forbid, forgot the quote 8 before a cousin's name. The penalty was polite silence and a mental note that you were clearly not their sort. Then came the nicknames, operating on their own completely arcane logic. There was always a Buzzy, a Toddy, or a Muffin, names sounding like beloved family pets, but bestowed upon grown adults who'd long since outlived their original mischief. Some families recycled nicknames generation after generation, leading to the bizarre spectacle of a toddler and a septuagenarian answering to Bitsy in the same room. Surnames were wielded like social currency itself. To be addressed by your last name alone was a sign of respect, provided it came from someone within the accepted social perimeter. To outsiders, using a surname without permission was considered almost criminal, like borrowing the family silver without asking. In conversation, first names were reserved exclusively for those closest in confidence. You might be Margaret to your childhood playmate, but Mrs. Chambers to the woman who'd lived next door for 40 years. Even husbands and wives sometimes addressed each other by formal names in public, a reminder that affection was never displayed publicly. Navigating this world required careful listening and strategic ambiguity. Many a newcomer survived season after season by mastering the universal darling or dear, terms allowing you to greet half the room without committing to anyone's actual name. Tonight, as you reflect on your own connections without such complexity, remember, the sweetest music is being called by someone who knows you well. Whatever name they choose to use, as you sink deeper into your blanket fortress tonight, spare a thought for those brave souls who spent their days navigating a labyrinth of etiquette so complex that even the silverware seemed to judge them. They survived not just wealth, but the slow suffocation of rules about napkins, hats, and exactly how many times you could say thank you before being labeled emotionally unstable. Every family breakfast was a silent test, every handshake and negotiation. Every parlor room was a battleground of carefully disguised snobbery. For all the luxury, life at the top meant living under a microscope. One raised eyebrow from a matriarch, one poorly timed giggle at the wrong sort of joke, and your social calendar could be wiped out like yesterday's caviar. But inside those polished mansions and on those perfectly manicured lawns, there was also resilience, a stubborn, almost ridiculous insistence on tradition, community, and making things harder than they needed to be. These people survived generational feuds over flower arrangements, the existential terror of birthday parties, and more charity galas than any human being should ever have to attend. So tonight, as you drift off in your own bed with pajamas that don't match, with a fan humming and nobody grading your posture, maybe offer a silent thank you to your ancestors, the ones who figured out how to survive not only famine and winter, but also dinner parties with 14 forks and a room full of people pretending not to judge. Because history isn't just about suffering and struggle, it's proof that humans, in all our stubborn, hopeful, and gloriously absurd ways, will endure anything, even an oyster fork. Rest easy, knowing you won't be exiled for eating toast with your hands, and may your dreams be free of monogrammed towels and unsolicited advice from great aunts. Sleep well,